Hi, Paul.
Good afternoon, Lo.
Nice to see you here.
Yes,
Welcome.
it's great to be back.
Yeah, welcome to the Artist Focus. Um, I'm here today with, I'm an artist in Toronto. My name is Lo, she, her. And I'm here today with my old friend, Paul Couillard, who has been working as a queer artist, curator, and performance art scholar since 1985. Paul has created more than 300 solo and collaborative performance works in 26 countries, often working with his lovely partner, Ed Johnson, who I also adore. Paul was the performance art curator for FADO Performance Art Centre here in Toronto, a very active organization. They've been here since from 1993 to until 2007. Oh, he was actually, Paul was the curator of FADO and one of the founder of FADO. He was the curator from 93 to 2007. FADO was still operating, and everybody knows FADO, performanceart.ca. But yeah, Paul started it, so that's really exciting, 1993 until 2007. He's also a founding co-curator of Toronto's 7A11D International Festival of Performance Art, which hopefully some people have been to, and they have such a wonderful offering. Paul has also been a lecturer at McMaster University and the University of Toronto Scarborough, and he holds a doctorate from the York Ryerson Joint Graduate Program in Communication and Culture.
Ryerson now is Toronto Metropolitan University.
Yes.
But, they've changed their name since I got my degree.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I was thinking, should I change that? But I mean that, yeah, anyway. So TMU, we call it now. So York and TMU, he went there for his PhD. And I've known Paul, as I say, for about 20 years, since my first encounters with the performance art scene in Toronto. And Paul has always been such a good host to integrate and talk with artists seeking out this kind of work. Paul's numerous performances, curations, books, and just general presence at events has made him one of the most well-known members of our community. So we're really happy to have Paul as part of our artists focus here, representing Toronto and the Toronto scene. But yeah, and seeing Paul's performances has really been pivotal in my understanding of the scope and possibility of both durational and site-specific works. And I've known for the past year that Paul was in Japan in the summer of 2024. So I kept wanting to catch up with him and say, Paul, what happened in Japan? That must have been such a really great cross-cultural experience. And I mean, I don't know if you probably performed in Japan before. I imagine you've performed so widely. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you about your trip and see what you had to say, and we can have a conversation around that.
Yes, I'm really happy to talk about the visit to Japan last year. It was a really intensive experience. I think I did at least 3 or 4 different performances and 2 artist talks in about a 2-week span of, being there, traveling through multiple parts of Japan. And for me, it was quite a momentous moment because it was really the first kind of touring as a performance artist that I had done post the COVID, pandemic. So it was kind of like a return to something that I'd been missing for a number of years. And I went to Japan, as you mentioned, I have been there before. My first visit to Japan was actually my first travel abroad back in 1991 when I was invited by Taro Ito to Performance Camp Tajima, and I was in Japan for about 3 months, and it was really seminal to my practice in terms of shifting from work that up to that point had been, I would say, very theatrically based, certainly very word based, and then arriving in Japan and thinking, well, what am I going to do here? Because if I speak English, they're not necessarily going to understand anything I'm saying. So it was my first experience and what propelled me into thinking in terms of responding to sight, in terms of building images without words, and sort of like throwing away my reliance on scripts and text as a kind of crutch. So it really altered my practice in enormous ways. So to go back 33 years later and to see first how the country had changed, but also to have my own history was really a wonderful opportunity for me. So I was invited to an event called Responding Performance Art Initiative, which is organized by Daisuke Takeya, who will be familiar to many of the viewers here. Daisuke has been regularly featured, I think, with Out of Sight. And his event, which he calls an initiative or project, not a festival, takes place over 11 days. It's a really comprehensive event that involves many different things that I'll get into in a bit. But the core to this year's event, that 2024's event, which was the sixth iteration of it, was responding and healing. And in a way, Daisuke was thinking about, he has a center called DICE, which is based in the Ishinomaki area, which was one of the areas that was hardest hit by the sort of Great East Japan earthquake in 2011, the earthquake and tsunami, which also led to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So he wanted to do something, an event where he invited artists to think in terms of responding and healing, specifically referencing that 2011 sort of massive event. So that's kind of like a huge responsibility already on your shoulders to think about how do I address such a huge, topic to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how did you?
Well, when I went there, I should say something about my practice, which is that I usually don't have any clue what I'm going to do until I arrive in a location. I'm not one of those artists who can go into the studio and build a performance and then take it on the road. That's just not the way I work. My work is always a dialogue and a conversation with local sites. So in a way, this whole idea of responding was perfect to my practice. But that being said, there's always things that are kind of in the ether that you're working on when you think about going to a location. You do advanced research, you try and find out about the area, its history, the people, etc. But I was thinking a lot about history and memory and what those two things are and how they relate to each other. History being that sort of broad overview from outside, and memory being that very personal, coming from one's own sensation, understanding. So I was wondering about these two different kinds of understanding and how they intersect with each other. The other thing I'll say is, also when I arrived in Japan, I had this initial invitation from Daisuke, but then I also know other artists in Japan. So I was aware that Sakiko Yameoka has a group, has an overall group called Epamia, which has a fantastic archive of performance art, but that had created a subgroup called Durational Performance Project Tokyo. And so she and this group have been specifically exploring durational performance, which of course is one of the areas where I would say my own work is very strong, something that's been a major theme in a lot of the work I do. I often do performances that are 24 hours or longer. So I contacted her because I thought it could be interesting to do something. And she asked me to also do what ended up being a 24-hour performance. and a talk about durational performance in Tokyo. So I was working in different places in different venues. And what I really wanted to say about that is to talk a little bit about the idea of the eternal network, or the fête permanente, which actually would translate as sort of continual celebration. But this is an idea that was started by Robert Fillieux and Georges Brecht back in the early 60s. And it's really it's become a whole strata of art practice and art dissemination. Because, of course, when we move in the art world, there's many different sort of strata of art. There's the public gallery system, there's the biennale system, there's a whole, sort of slew of different residencies one can go to. There's commercial art. So an artist has to sort of find the niches in which they work. And what I work in is really comes out of this idea that Fillieux called the eternal network, which is really about artists cooperating and artists understanding each other as a network, and supporting each other's work, and creating venues for each other's work. And I know this is something, of course, you're very involved with too. And I would say Out of Sight really fits into that sort of context as well. So this was an idea of Fillieux from the 60s. And if people aren't that familiar with Robert Fillieux, the one thing they might know about him is that he's the person who declared January 17th, 1963 as art's millionth birthday. And so now every year since then, artists around the world celebrate art's birthday on January 17th. The most recent one would have been the 1,062nd birthday of art.
I had no idea there was something to celebrate in January.
Absolutely. So putting that sort of bit of kind of, that's the history end of things, in a way of thinking about where I fit in art practice. So I was invited to Japan by Daisuke. These events are often, to a large degree, self-financed by the artists themselves. Daisuke is an extremely generous artist. First because I said, well, I can't just show up at the festival and start working right away. It's with the jet lag and everything, it's too much. So I arrived in Tokyo, and he has a studio in Hayama, which is kind of a city just a little bit south of Tokyo. And, he said, here, you can stay basically, I'll set up a bed in my studio. You can stay there and have a few days to sort of acclimatize. It meant that I could go into Tokyo and also see the events happening that Sakiko was doing prior to my event, and sort of acclimatize. He showed me around Hayama, where he grew up, and showing me like the Buddhist temples there and that kind of thing. So and this whole idea of the eternal network is about not necessarily just privileging the presentation of my individual artwork, but this whole connection and sort of understanding the lives of other artists and the communities in which they work, and getting this kind of broader sense of the world. So that was a key element of my trip to Japan, was actually, this sort of being taken into various artists' lives and studios and how they live. So
has that happened in other cities? Like, I think it must happen in other cities, but maybe because also Japan is so far away, it might be like one of those places where all this person's coming all this way. We really have to do it as much as we can to really invite this person in. And
yeah, I think of it as kind of a feature of this whole artist network that's been created, right? So the other thing that happened was, because the Responding Festival was, I think, going to include about 20 artists or so coming, most in Japan, but a number of them coming from other parts of the world. Another artist who people here might be familiar with, Graciela Ovejero Postigo, from Argentina, had said, well, I want to do an event in Tokyo. So Daisuke organized or found a group that was willing to co-sponsor an event in Tokyo at a place called Subterranean Theater. And it was supposed to be, I think, 6 artists performing collaboratively. However, 3 of those artists ended up not being able to come to the festival because of various problems of like spouses being sick, getting visa issues, all kinds. So because 3 of the international artists had to drop out, Daisuke asked me at the last minute, do you want to fill in for basically for these 3 artists, Graciela, Nantawat Machai from Thailand and Kelvin Shine Ko from Myanmar, and sort of be sort of step into their shoes because none of them can make it.
Wow.
So I said, okay. I like to collaborate. I like encounters. The interesting thing, so the 4 artists who ended up participating, the interesting thing was, I mean, I knew Daisuke at this point, but I had not seen his work in person. And the other artists involved were Sandra Corrigan-Brethnack, who will also be familiar to people at Out of Sight from Ireland, and Min Su Su from Taiwan. And I didn't really know either of them, and I'd never seen their work. So suddenly I'm in a situation where I have to perform with 3 other people, none of whose work I've seen before. And there's sort of, it's a kind of in the moment improvisational collaboration. So how is this going to work?
Amazing.
So that was sort of the introductory performance that I did. And because there were so many unknowns, the artists that weren't there all submitted a sort of 5-minute videotape each of performances they'd done because they wanted to feel they were still part of the event. But some of the artists, Sandra in particular, said, well, we don't want to just show them at the beginning and sort of, have them as an aside. They should somehow be integrated into the work. So I decided that my role as the sort of interloper or stand-in was that I would be responsible for the projector. We would put their performances on a loop, and I would work on projecting the performances, which were all very different from each other, in ways that I would weave them into the overall performance, because we also didn't want as like some big backdrop that everybody's performing against. So basically my job was to figure out a way to project and reproject these images in a way that would weave itself into the overall texture of the collaboration.
Wow. And
that was the only way I could imagine working with a group of unknowns. And in fact, it ended up being a very magical event. My original performance art teacher, Rachel Rosenthal, used to have an expression when things are really clicking in a kind of improvisation. She would say, the jinn are with us, like the genies are sort of like helping us. So the jinn were really with us that night.
Paul, do you have images of that, or?
That one, unfortunately, I don't have any images of because there are some images, but they're all really poor quality.
I think there's a nice link with a description of what happened there, right?
Yes, I had sent that to you.
Add that somewhere, but yeah, I remember reading about it. It sounded really intricate and beautiful. Yeah. How long was the performance?
It ended up being about 1 hour and 3/4 to 2 hours long.
Okay.
So I was on a 15-minute loop with the videos. So basically, try projecting them here. Now let's bring them into projecting them on bodies, projecting them at this scale, projecting them at this scale, projecting them on the ceiling, projecting them on my body, and various sort of like ways of integrating them.
Beautiful, yeah. To somehow embody those 3 people.
So that was a pretty good intensive beginning to the trip.
Hello, Japan.
And then we headed off to Ishinomaki, which is, I'd say, at least a 6-hour drive from Tokyo or from Haima. It's more to the north of Japan. And Ishinomaki, the DICE performance space, is set up in what used to be a kind of farmhouse.
Mm-hmm.
That Daisuke, I guess, has acquired and is now building on, like renovated and is building onto and building various bedrooms and residencies so that it can actually operate as an artist residency sort of year round.
Amazing.
And sees it as something larger than himself. And I should say, for the Responding Festival itself, Daisuke is certainly my contact and the main organizer, but it's really a team of artists in Japan who do it. So there's Yujuru Maeda who really took over the role of translating, which was amazing because all the international artists are using kind of English as their lingua franca. So there was a lot of translating back and forth into Japanese and from Japanese into English. And then Maron Shibukawa, who wrote extensively about all of the events that took place at the initiative. Takumi-chan, Mineki Murata, Miri Hamada. So it's a number of artists who really come together to kind of make this event happen. So the Responding Festival, initiative project or initiative. As I said, it's very intensive. There was an international symposium that took place at the called On a Sedimentation of Memories, that took place at a museum where it's the elementary school ruins of Ishinomaki City. So Kanadowaka Elementary School ruins. So it's a school that basically the tsunami hit and destroyed, and then these burning buildings were on fire floating, and then that hit the school and set it in flames as well.
Wow.
So what they've done with this school is the shell of the structure is still there, and there's like buildings or whatever, but they're allowing nature to kind of return and take it over. So it sits as a museum that's constantly changing. And then they've built a kind of center beside it where the gymnasium was that has, more didactic sort of materials about the earthquake and so it was in that context that we were doing this symposium that was about this idea of the sedimentation memories and healing and responding. So there was that event. Then one of the interesting things, and maybe I'll ask Karen to pull up the presentation now, because Daisuke wants to involve the community, he asked all of the participants to get involved in an event there, which is basically a parade. They have something called the Ishinomaki River Festival, and this is the Tairyo Odori Parade, where basically a whole bunch of different groups all dress up in traditional Japanese garb and parade through the streets doing a specific dance. And it's the same dance that all the different groups are doing. So as a group, all of the participants had to learn this dance, and and we performed. I mean, it was a durational event in itself because we must have, it sort of happens at dusk. So it's light out when you start, and by the time it ends, you're carrying lanterns, and so it's all dark. But we must have marched for 2 hours at least. So there's our little group. You can see Sandra's in there and Daisuke, but then I was at the back carrying 2 of the lanterns. I had not been able to learn the steps because soon after I arrived at in Ishinomaki, I developed COVID. So I was sick the day we were learning the steps. So I didn't really know the steps. So I said, well, I'll carry the lanterns.
Yeah, that's a good little tip.
But the thing about this the parade is that that's really one of the main tools that they use to kind of advertise the initiative and the events that take place at DICE and there was at a theater space in Ishinomaki City itself. So they have flyers that as we were parading through the streets, we were passing out flyers with the events at the theater sort of listed on them. And that was how people knew that we were doing this other event.
Beautiful way to advertise.
Yeah. And then the next thing that happened was for 3 days, a group of us from Ishinomaki went to Fukushima, which is probably a 2-hour drive from Ishinomaki. And that's where the nuclear disaster happened. Mm-hmm. So Daisuke wanted to have us do, he called it the Fukushima sessions. So he wanted to give us an opportunity to do actions on various sites in Fukushima, not really for the local audience, because the relationship is fraught. And this is called responding and healing, and it's very weird, the idea that somehow we would come and be able to tell these people something about how to respond or how heal in face of this sort of tragedy. In fact, it was, if anything, just the opposite of. Daisuke set it up so that we went to various locations. We met with various individuals there who were trying to regenerate activity in Fukushima, and they really instructed us on responding and healing and how they are going about rebuilding community and dealing with cleaning up nuclear waste and we were performing at times in a site where that was literally ground zero, that every single person had been evacuated at a certain point, and now there are people living there, but it's Daisuke had to work for months with various locations, finding spots that would be okay for us to perform, and not really inviting a local public, but putting us in contact with various people who were working there and contacting through a network there, saying, well, we will be doing these actions, so people are welcome to show up if they wish, but not sort of advertising it as a big public event. So I chose to work at an area that was right on the beach, where a giant berm or dam has now been constructed to basically deal with the possibility of future tsunamis, and where they have planted vast tracts of sort of pine trees that are currently just like tiny little, seedlings. They're about, less than 10 years old, but one day will be giant forests. And because of the nature of the event, we're really performing in a sense for each other, for the other performers there. I wondered whether what I was doing was even a performance. To me, it was more about this research and thinking around this idea of responding and healing. And so I did something that I called 3 dialogues. So I said to the people present, well, I'm interested in having a dialogue with the sea, with these giant sort of concrete structures that they put in that are like breakwaters, and with this young seedling forest. So I said, you can watch me in what I'm doing, but what I was really inviting people to do was to have their own dialogue with these things. And again, this happened late in the day, close to sunset. So the light was, there's sort of a magic time where the light changes and it's not dark yet, but colors somehow become even more intense. So that was the time of day that I was performing, and I performed, I guess, for about an hour, or had this dialogue for about 20 minutes roughly with each section. So this is me walking into the waves, and there you can see on the edge a few of those concrete sort of breakwater structures I'm talking about. And this was a very calm sea, but even there you can see the waves are as high as I am. And this is nothing. This is a calm, friendly ocean, right? So I was walking out into the waves sort of as far as I could, and trying to just sort of like stand and feel them come in and sort of, have this kind of dialogue with them. But of course, eventually, even though this is a calm sea, I was actually swept up in one of the waves and, pulled underneath. And then, so that was the end of that particular section. And then I stepped up onto these sort of concrete structures, and a lot of people chose to sit on them to sort of watch me. And, you can see I'm there on the right, sprawled out on one of the structures, but the way they're set up, they're just kind of like, it's almost like a Tetris where they're sort of jammed in on each other. But there's little caves and sort of grottos within them and underneath them. So I was moving in them. There you can see I'm sort of inside, underneath, and you can see some of them are full of, like, my hands are full of iron ore there, because that was sort of trace that was coming off of some of those concrete movements. So I was basically working on different forms, different positions that my body could take in relation to these huge concrete forms. And then I came to the top of the dam, looking over onto the
seedlings.
The seedlings, and there you can see the dam, get a sort of better sense of the scale.
Yeah.
And then slowly I walked down towards them, taking sort of like pauses at various distances, and then eventually went right into where they were and sat with them for about 20 minutes, just, hearing the insects, hearing the birds, hearing the sort of, just trying to, commune with the plants and with nature.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really love that idea of, it's a research that's open, like it's an open proposal for people to experience their own embodiment in that situation.
Yes, and as I said, partly because I've done so few performances during the COVID time, and hadn't traveled internationally for a while. It's like, it takes a while to get back on the bicycle and sort of figure out what you're doing, and understanding what kind of dialogue you want to have. So it took a lot of pressure off me to not have to think of it as a kind of like, this is a performance for the people, but, more as I'm opening up my artistic process. We're thinking about responding. We're thinking about healing. And here are some of the ways I think about how I dialogue with things that are larger than myself in the world.
Yeah, and there's such a beautiful way of like holding, just holding space for interpretation, or it's not overly determined in that responsive embodiment, and also, as you say, like, you're new to the land there, so to listen quietly makes so much sense, and it does seem aligned with the proposal. So yeah.
And also, not, for me, it's like not to assume how things should be done, but just to say, this is what I do. It might be useful or not useful to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the fact that you're not necessarily the expert there, but you can sense through, what do I want to do? What would be, what is my response? Like, literally living the performance is the lived experience of being there. Yeah, and creating a sense of
that was very profound. And the other thing I was very sensitive to in that particular process and being in that area, there's a lot of areas you're told you can't go because cleanup hasn't happened. So you can't sort of stray off the beaten track, because if you go into that very interesting looking abandoned structure, everything in there is radioactive. And hasn't been cleaned. So you really have to, you're really aware of these sort of unseen presences that are still visible, and different sort of forms of visibility. So in Fukushima, there's areas that are just empty tracts of land now where there were buildings that have been taken down, and the waste has been taken away to a contamination site. There are structures where people have not given permission to have their homes destroyed, even though they can't live there anymore. So there's structures that are basically like like that elementary school I talked about, slowly returning to the earth, like nature is slowly transforming them, but they're just abandoned structures. And then there's all these new buildings that are just like, been built in the past few years. And there's also this giant infrastructure of roads that's clearly designed for a much larger population than the few cars you see there, where what used to be a city now has 100 people living there, So there's this interesting layering of presences and absences that one is always sort of like trying to think about. And to me, this requires a lot of time to just sit and in a kind of stillness and sort of like listen and observe and feel.
So it's like, the site itself is so steeped with such a particular story and layered stories that just going there is like the research.
And young story, 2011 is not very long ago when you're talking about a nuclear disaster, right?
Yeah, exactly. And why do you think that Daisuke proposed that foreign artists or international artists should be the ones to come and do this healing program? Was it somehow for him, for other people to witness this site? Like, would that feel healing to him as an artist or as a Japanese person who's from, do you think... Do you know?
I can't speak for Daisuke. What I can say is that many of the people who he introduced us to, one of the reasons they were happy to talk to us about their experiences and to invite us to do things there was specifically because they are looking for witnesses. They are looking for people to say, look, you can do things here. It's, there's still the possibility of life here. It's not just a dead zone, But,
that's good too. Yeah. I mean, even when I think I heard Daisuke talk about it somewhere probably at a flow event or something, but that idea that, it's not contaminated, like wasn't it dangerous going there, So for them to be able to say, no, we open this site to the world. Like it's not all closed off. It's not, there's life here and it's regenerating.
Well, and, one of the things, when we were in Ishinomaki, one of the things was people were told, you don't have to go to Fukushima. You could just stay at Dice for several days while we go there because people may not feel safe there, because even though the government says it's safe, you see things like on that dam that I showed you, there was a line that's painted onto the dam, and it basically says, don't go past this point because beyond that point it could be contaminated. And it's like, it raises so many questions about, well, how localized can radiation be,
like that line specifically,
So it's a really, you have to be mindful of your own willingness to take risk and your own looking after your own safety to some degree as well. Because as I said, don't go off the beaten track because there are areas that are still contaminated.
I mean, in a way that's great to invite performance artists who are regularly kind of thinking around risk taking or taking a risk, a cultural risk or a personal risk. So it's interesting to think of that group of people who might be able to, address that task of coming to observe and be in the land.
And there are maps that show how geography and weather patterns and stuff, affected, because it's not like the radiation hits everywhere equally, right? I mean, ash rose and fell in particular locations. So it's like there are hot spots and there are safe spots, all of this kind of stuff is all, I think, really interesting territory when you're thinking about responding to site and the visibility and invisibility of what is there. Because I think a lot of what I do in terms of responding to site is making visible things that are very present for me, but that we don't necessarily usually acknowledge with our senses or with our eyes or, in our conversation in terms of like energies or so this is a very sort of delicate and interesting kind of like place to think about those kinds of issues.
Yeah, were there moments where you were like, oh, I don't know if I should have taken this risk, or
I felt very safe and comfortable. I certainly felt well looked after by the Japanese artists. So and by the various groups that they made it their job to make sure that we spent time with and talked to and heard, so I felt very safe.
Yeah, that's cool.
So then, of course, we headed back to DICE, which is DICE, by the way, stands for Diversity Art Interactive Studio. And in Ishinomaki, we did a performance in a theater, which was very challenging for me because I don't do work in theaters, even though that's where, in a way, I started. It was very much a stage, and I thought, I'll do this thing in the audience. And the theater person was very insistent on like, no, you have to be on the stage, etc. So I ended up working with a rock that I had found in Ishinomaki, and I did a piece called Watashi no Tomodachi, which means my friend. And the rock was essentially my friend, and I was having a conversation with the rock, and and so here I'm taking a selfie of myself with the rock, which is also something I would never do, but since we're putting it on a stage, it's sort of like that. In a way, I'm referencing all of that, and I did some sort of movements with the rock, and in the end, another one of the artists, Tokyo Murayama, was so enamored with this rock that he asked to take it and put it in his garden, where it now is.
Amazing.
And I sang a song, which is the Song of the Sad Young Man, which is, I guess, what I was trying to do because of all the sharing that had gone on among the artists, and because the artists were certainly at least half of the audience watching. I was thinking about other forms of trauma and really thinking about the kind of carried PTSD around the whole AIDS crisis that I have, and how that's changed my relationship to other people, and in a way moved me toward a different relationship with other non-human creatures. I mean, I've done a whole series of performances that I call performances for rocks that are not on my resume, that really I only do them in nature, and they're for the rocks, whatever that means, and that's the question really, is what kind of gesture would be of any kind of significance or meaningfulness to a rock. So in a way, I'm referencing all of that here in this sort of little short performance that I did in a theater space.
Yeah, and I mean the site specificity of a theater space as well, like trying to take a site-specific practice and plunk it in a theater with all that.
Right, but also a space that, it's not like we had days and days to spend in the theater to kind of work out
exactly.
its little kinks and figure out what it could be as a site.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last event that was supposed to take place as part of responding was something called the Choto Festival. And it's sort of related to that time of year in Japan is Obon, which is the time where the ancestors, meaning all the dead, your dead ancestors, kind of return, and you celebrate with them. So this Choto Festival, which is a huge event at DICE and brings, like, I don't know, 400 people to that space where they do drumming and, you know, got rained out by a typhoon.
Oh.
So that event couldn't happen, which of course was very disappointing to Daisuke because it's such an important connection with the community itself. But that just gives you a sense of the kind of variation of different things that happen in this really short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So yeah, thank you for that. Coming back. Oh, is that it for the? Oh, you have another image.
Then I went on to Tokyo. Like, if we're running out of time, I don't have to talk about it. But
There's
that's
an hour. I mean, an hour. There's 10 minutes. 9 minutes.
So then I went to Tokyo, where I was working with Tsukiko Yameoke and Seiko Kiriyama, who have this, as I said, this group, Ipamiya and DPPT. And what was going to be an 8-hour performance, they said, let's try it as a 24-hour performance. And their group of about 6 or 7 artists, plus a few of the people who had been at Ishinomaki, chose to stay all through the night, like basically for the whole performance. So I had this sort of captive audience of about 10 people plus people who would come and go. And I decided to return to a practice I hadn't done in a number of years of these silence performances, which are dialogues with other artists. So this was silence number 9, called More Vasya Than Vasya, with thanks to Vasya Vasileva. So this is an image of Vasya Vasileva, and you can see she has her hands over her face. These works are basically in dialogue with works by those artists that I've seen. They're not necessarily conversations with the artists themselves. They're conversations of my work with their work in a way. So obviously I began with this image. And I had all of this wet laundry that I brought back from Ishinomaki that I hadn't had the dryers in the hotel we'd stayed in the last night hadn't worked properly. So all this laundry was wet. So I thought, well, I'll work with that. That would make sense in terms of Vasya's practice. And so this is, a little handkerchief that I have. I still have it here.
Oh, wow.
And I was tossing it back and forth to kind of like get the airflow to make it dry. And then I was tossing it up in the air. And then it became a kind of game with the audience. And then there you can see that's a shirt that I'm playing with, that we're throwing back and forth between the audience. And then I would hang these things up once they were somewhat dry. So that was sort of my first action to kind of get me going. And I had 3 books because this, the space it was at, Para, was a space that's the kind of used bookstore neighborhood of Tokyo. So I went to some of these used bookstores and picked up some books that I found interesting. Obviously, I couldn't read them because they're in Japanese. But I broke the 24 hours into 3 sections. So the first book or the first section was history, and the second book or section was literature, and the third was politics. So I'm trying to think about different ways of communicating. And this first section I called Slow Bongo because that's a sort of joke between Vasya and I about emails back and forth and the sort of like conversations that happen out of sync when you're online. So we call it Slow Bongo. So I was actually using the book like a bongo, sort of, wandering through the space and thinking about vibration and sound and non-textual ways to kind of communicate. Here you can see underwear was, sort of nothing was off limits in terms of my wet laundry. And I was taking pages from the book, the first book, and writing sort of slogans about history, like, and then sewing the pages onto my pants. One of the artists, who had done an event the first week that I was in Tokyo that I had seen before I went, Takehiro Ishida, was really treating my performance as a kind of workshop. So in many ways he would be doing the things I was doing. So I had this kind of ghost for a lot of the events, which was a really interesting way to have a relationship with the audience. So you see, I was making little sculptural objects. Here you can see, you can't really see it, but they're joined by a piece of thread. So here I'm writing on the first book, Slow Bongo. And this is the second book, part 2. And you can see the sort of slogan I came up with for that. And all of these were taken from correspondence between Vasya and I. This was "The demon of completion speaks through me." So I'm, and all of these gestures are really coming off of, in a kind of improvisational way. There you can see I'm mirroring my ghost at that point, because he had sort of fallen asleep on a beanbag. So I went and sort of like lay down beside him.
Oh my gosh.
At a certain point late in the evening, I have a yoga practice. So I did my 90-minute yoga session. And then at the end of it, the sun was coming up. And so I opened the blinds and had the sun coming in through the windows. This is a little question that came up that I wrote down, which was like, how do you express without language? And you can see every time I would write something in English, one of the DPPT people would write a Japanese translation, or as they understood it. We weren't really speaking, so it's not like we had a long conversation about what do you mean by that. So it's possible it could have been mistranslated. So this was a moment. For about an hour, I just went around the room and I was looking at various objects, touching them, touching myself, and then touching the object, sort of like trying to make those connections without language. And just, it's a very simple gesture, but when you do that over time and slowly and carefully and with real intention, it starts to build something up. So here I'm touching myself, and there I'm touching Takehiro. So you can see other things that happen with the objects. There I took a 15-minute rest period, so I wrote 15-minute rest on that piece of paper about language. I also, there was a section where I just took a whole spool of thread and slowly unwound it. And then Takehiro started doing the same thing with a white piece of thread, but he was making very different sort of shapes with it.
Wow.
And then we ended up with this, and, then I had to basically took a piece of tweezers and kind of like made the white pile look like the red pile. And then at a certain point, other audience members were also getting involved. So, this one, there we were sort of like draping the thread onto his hand, and with the third book, Politics, this is still the second book, Literature, there was a leaf image on the front. So I went through every page and I was drawing that leaf figure onto each page. I also had a set of microscopes because I was really interested in scale. So every so often I would take just one character from a page in the book and put it under the microscope so that you would only see that one character, not trying to say, don't focus on the text as a whole, focus on the marks, focus on the mark making, focus on the knots of the threads that I'm using, because I was binding people with threads. So, and this was the third 8-hour session, which was Politics, and which I called Fresh Air, where I actually opened the windows because I couldn't speak, or I couldn't breathe in this closed space. So here I had needles hanging, and so people were sort of playing with things I had made in the space, and this person was concerned that the needles might jab somebody, so they actually put little pieces of gum on them to sort of like, keep the points from jabbing anybody. So, and because I was interested in scale, I was taking little bits of detritus from the bottoms of people's shoes and from various parts of the room, and making little slides out of them that people could look at under the microscope.
Oh, wow.
Because I was really trying to get people to look differently, see differently, see on different scales.
Yeah.
And then eventually I had these threads on myself, and I got completely tangled up in them and created this huge knot that a bunch of the participants got and spent an hour just trying to undo these knots. And I was basically just a standing figure while they were undoing the knots.
Wow.
And that was a fantastic moment. And I thought, great, this is a great way to end it. I'm exhausted. You know, I wouldn't usually do a 24-hour performance right after doing an 11-day festival. You know, so I thought, this is perfect. However, there was still 2 or 3 hours left. And I realized that because of the nature of the way these events are set up, all of these people were just starting to arrive, and important people in terms of Sakiko and Sakiko's, wanting to have her contacts with the art community and people who could have perhaps fund her organization and support her organization. So I've got to do something, even though I'm exhausted and I'm sort of out of ideas and I've lost the sort of thread of the performance. Yeah. So I went back to tossing the handkerchief, but I could tell it wasn't reading. It just didn't have the same energy in the room. So eventually what I ended up doing was just sitting in for the last hour in a chair, just holding that handkerchief with one hand, because that was all the energy I had left, was just to hold this and try and keep it from falling.
Oh my God.
And so that was the way the performance ended.
Wow. Bravo. Bravo. Thank you for describing that.
Anyways, unfortunately, I think I've talked on and we're just about out of time.
Wonderful. Yeah, we only have a minute or so left, but even like the things with the knots, was that something that they decided to do, or was it you were making little instructions through the translators a little bit, or?
No, I didn't really speak. In fact, it's called a silence, so I don't speak for that 24-hour period at all. So other than writing those pieces of text that you saw that designated the different sections of the performance, it's all, interpretation has to be nonverbal.
Wow.
Although of course the audience is allowed to speak, and certainly does speak during it. So Paul, this was so gorgeous. Thank you for sharing that. Would you want to say anything else about your experience to sum up, or? How do you sum up that kind of intensity of experience? I mean, as I said, for me, it was really special and important to be able to go back to Japan 33 years later, and it felt in a way like a renewal for me of my practice and my thinking about performance, and sort of like a launch into the next era, because it was after that first trip to Japan that I started FADO and, did all that sort of, began traveling internationally, all of that stuff, right? So for me, this was a kind of return and renewal. So, and in a way, weaving back into those thoughts about responding and healing.
Incredible. Paul, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening and for joining us for this beautiful talk. Thank you again, Paul, for all your work, and everybody for being part of Out of Sight, and for Karan organizing these talks and giving us this opportunity to really unpack things.